everybody. This is our second session on this topic, but as I hope you'll see, very much from the first session, we could have all carried on talking for ages about it because it's such an interesting topic that, and it's one of those topics that everybody's got a view on. When you talk about AI, it creates, everybody from a personal and a business perspective has a view on it. And I personally come to this session with several different hats and kind of thoughts and views on AI. My name is Helen Kwahuna. I'm the head of employment at DLA Piper Hong Kong. And law is one of the professions that allegedly AI is going to impact on quite significantly. Allegedly, that's lawyers speak. And frankly, from a very personal perspective, I can't possibly be, because what I do is so important and involves so much human thoughts and intelligence. How can AI possibly get involved? But actually, it already is. And I think very much the theme of what we want to talk about today is that AI is not really a buzzword. I mean, it's something that's talked about a lot, but it's not really a phase or a trend or something that's coming down the pipeline. It is here. It's already making a significant impact across all different sectors and different businesses, and it's going to continue to do that. So what we wanted to very much talk about today with the panellists is kind of what their own experiences within their own organisations are, what kind of studies they're seeing in terms of how it's affecting employers more broadly, and kind of when I introduce the panellists, you'll see that they've all worked in different locations, doing different roles, and so it'll be interesting to draw out their experiences of how Hong Kong in particular is doing in this area, and whether they're pessimistic, optimistic, or not yet sure about how Hong Kong is kind of going to cope. And building on what Kate was talking about this morning, which is how do we go from survive to thrive? I think that's very much an important lens through which to look at AI, which is it's here, it's going to continue. So how do we as organisations go from just coping with that reality to using it to our advantage and turning it into a positive, which has a lot of challenges for HR from a human perspective as well. And when I was preparing for this panel, I was thinking, my own very basic view of AI historically has been just looking at what the headlines say about it, which has all been quite doom and gloom, which is why it'll be interesting to hear from the panellists what their view of it is. But I looked up what some people who in my mind were quite leaders in the area or hugely intelligent human beings and what they were saying about it, and I found it quite scary actually. So Stephen Hawking said, the development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race. It would take off on its own and redesign itself at an ever-increasing rate. Humans who are limited by slow biological evolution couldn't compete and would be superseded, which didn't really inspire me with huge levels of confidence. Elon Musk said, with artificial intelligence, we're summoning the demon. And a tech columnist in the New York Times said, the upheavals of AI can escalate quickly and become scarier and even cataclysmic. Imagine how a medical robot originally programmed to rid cancer could conclude that the best way to obliterate cancer is to exterminate humans who are genetically prone to the disease. So with that very pessimistic start, it can only get better from here. But that was just my view based on the search and what does AI actually mean. So just introducing the panel. I'll start with Michael, because he's going to try and answer the question of what is AI, no pressure. So Michael Gold, who's with the Economist Intelligence Unit. To his left, Gautam Dev, who's the Regional HR Director for Prudential, and is going to, I think, have some really great insights into what Prudential has been doing and his own experiences. And I have to say, and this is a compliment, I was very surprised at how progressive Prudential has been in kind of thinking about the issues and addressing the issues. Patrick Kirby from KPMG, who's also worked in a number of different locations and is going to talk about some of the studies and things that he's seen and what his own organisation is doing. And then last but not least, we've got Ashley from Agile One, who has been involved in AI for 25 years, and I didn't realise AI had been around that long, but that just shows my level of awareness of the issues, who's going to talk quite a bit about big data and what the impact has been for organisations. So I'm going to start with Michael because the Economist Intelligence Unit have done quite a few interesting studies around this area quite recently. So at a very macro level, it's going to kind of introduce the topic and sort of what AI means.
Okay, great.
Easy question to start
with. I know,
with.
right? I just narrow it down. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you for that lovely introduction. I mean, with your sort of preamble, it kind of just got me thinking about it's great fun in a way to talk about the really sort of big existential questions kind of around like AI and humanity and Cylons and the T9000 and all that stuff. But really, I mean, like what we're talking about when we look at AI is in the workforce in particular is quite different. Let me just introduce myself very briefly. I'm Michael Gold with the Economist Intelligence Unit, based here in Hong Kong. And as Helen pointed out, we do reports with working alongside sponsors and other brands and companies to kind of shape ideas, from a variety of perspectives, and many of those involve technology, and in particular, AI is becoming one of the big hot topics that we're constantly sort of consigned to sort of think of something smart to say about. So one report that we just released recently, called Labor Pains, Coming Shifts in the World of Work, looks quite broadly at sort of the shifts, everything from flexi work to to smart machines taking jobs and whatnot. But and AI was actually cited as the single most transformative factor by the experts that we spoke to, sort of coming down the pike to really upend the way business is done. Another report that we looked at, we launched about a year ago, called Artificial Intelligence in the Real World, the Business Case Takes Shape. It was based on a survey of about 200 executives around the world on their views toward AI and kind of how it's going to impact the working world. So, not to bombard you with statistics, but just to kind of get the juices flowing, 40% of the executives surveyed anticipate that AI will start displacing humans from some jobs in their industries within the next 5 years. AI will be actively implemented in the companies within the next 3 years, according to 75% of surveyed executives. Sort of by the same token, a lot of the people surveyed are a bit more pessimistic about their managers' understanding of AI. So 30% say senior management lack an understanding sort of what AI really means. And but I think probably everyone in this room could probably qualify. And that 34% say that AI poses more risks than opportunities, whereas only 18% say the opposite. So it kind of gives you a sense of sort of some of the fears that you were just explaining before. So when you talk about sort of what AI is, right? I mean, you said it's not really a buzzword, but it is a catch-all, and it's also something that people sort of imbue a lot of their own kind of misunderstandings into. The funny thing about it is that it's more about a process than it is about sort of really creating human cognition, I would say. It's about a functional sort of efficiency raising measure that a lot of companies are using nowadays. And one expert that I've spoken to very succinctly put it that machine learning is a modern set of technologies for implementing AI. And so what that basically means is creating predictive models from data using algorithms. So it's actually quite straightforward when you think about it. The very sort of cerebral pie in the sky kind of attitude is that machines are going to replace humans because they realize that the better way to eradicate cancer is to exterminate us rather than just curing cancer. Actually, there's still, I mean, from my understanding, is there still needs to be human input along various points of the chain. This is something that we can get into quite a bit later, and we got into it quite in depth in our previous panel. But at this point, I'm not worried, and I don't know if any of my other panelists are worried that machines are really going to be able to think like humans, interact like humans, and do everything that a human can do very soon. But that's just, I know we're on video, so I have to caveat that. But anyway, that's kind of my conservative prediction.
Thank you. So, I won't mention the chess example and the Go example, where actually I think the computer...
I said everything that humans can do, not play chess.
Okay, caveat. So actually, do you want to talk a bit about your experience in this area and what you've been seeing?
Yeah, just a quick introduction. My name is Ashley Steinhausen. I work for a company called Agile One. As Helen said, I've been involved in the AI industry peripherally and sometimes a bit more in depth. for about 25 years. One of the things that I mentioned in the previous session is that the reason why, or one of the primary reasons why AI now is such a catch-all phrase and it's entering into daily language is because over the past 25, 30 years, what's happened is that the processing power that's been necessary to drive some of these techniques has come down very, very rapidly, and so it's now becoming able to go out into a much wider market. And so the implications for HR, which we were discussing earlier, they really vary quite a lot, and it also depends on exactly what you mean by AI. As Michael just said, AI is a bit of a catch-all phrase, and most of the work that I've done recently in that sort of broad area has been to do with big data and its impact on the use or the function of HR inside companies. I gave one example of where I think that this is all leading, is that I see in the near distant future that what's going to be taking place in terms of the function of HR is that it's going to be fundamentally changed. The relationship of HR to the business, where at present it tends to be more of a service. The example I gave earlier was that a business head will have an HR-related question. He'll send that HR-related question to the HR people, say, can you give me a report on this? They then go to the IT people generate a report, it comes back to HR, they have a look at it, and then it goes back to the business head. And that process, in my experience in large corporations, can sometimes take a couple of months. What we're going to see in the future is that most managers are going to have an AI-powered HR portal that they can ask questions of. Underlying that AI portal are going to be both descriptive and prescriptive analytics. It'll take into account things like organizational network analysis, social media analytics, and managers are going to be able to interrogate that portal and get the questions answered much quicker. That's going to change the relationship with HR. HR is going to be much more of an interpretive and advisory capacity rather than just being a sort of messenger for whatever it is that the managers want to use. I'll leave it there because I think that what we found before was that the interaction and the questions was better than just listening to us prattle on. So I'll leave it there and I'll pass over to
Gautam, and I just want to say, going to pass to Gautam, who's the regional HR director, so he's going to have a very good practical perspective, I think, on what challenges he's seen and what's been happening in his own organisation. And just to give you fair warning, he's going to have to sneak out about 5-10 minutes early. So if you've got questions for any of the panellists, please feel free to shout as we go along, but in particular for Gautam, don't save your questions till right at the end.
Thanks. And I apologise also, I picked up the dreaded Hong Kong flu, so, but I'll try and talk without a microphone. I'll use Trish's microphone. Can you hear me?
I do.
Okay, cool. I won't use that. So I'm in heated agreement with Ashley. Rather than a yes, but it's actually a yes and. We need to move now to a different kind of paradigm when we look at people. The example I gave in the previous one is if I had used our intelligence systems to pick a project manager for a particular project I'm running, it would have given me one kind of creature. But I picked a person from strategic procurement who has no HR background, has EQ that's somewhere to the right of Genghis Khan. It's absolutely terrible in terms of dealing with people, and would never have been hauled up by any kind of interpretive search. But liaising with her, catching her, I saw something, and she's run the best project. One of the best projects I've ever worked on. So this is the way in which I think HR can also start to add the value. It's being interpretive. I use the example of my sister who's a doctor, and the number of times she's saved lives by not listening to what the data tells her. So that's one piece. And it's a slightly romanticized piece, because you can't just move to instinct. You do have to listen to what's happening. But let's leave that to one side. Let's move to practical illustrations. So where we are very cognizant of AI and the impact that it's going to have is in our workforce planning. So when we look ahead to what it is we're going to need, it's complex enough without the AI factor. So the example I used was actuaries. We need as many actuaries as we can get. On a Friday night, I don a black outfit and go and kidnap these creatures. So basically, now, in countries such as Vietnam, there are 30 qualified actuaries in the whole country. While we're doing all this and planning forward, looking at supply, demand, or what have you, there's this huge push for AI that may well do away with a lot of those roles. When do we go? Do we go now and risk the fact that we're not going to have any actuaries available, or do we leave it and then have an underutilized workforce? So all this is driving the switch from hiring now much more for attitude than aptitude. So we still look for actuaries, we're looking for actuaries who can make the jump. We're looking for actuaries who can elevate. Because what's also happening now, the analogy I used last time around, was that we're seeing people moving further and further up onto dry land and scrambling to keep out of the reach of AI as it progressively laps at people's speeds and takes on more and more jobs. So what a second-year analyst actuary can do now, I can tell you, right now, in 5 years' time, will be done by AI. But then where do we build the skills for the top person? How do we bring that in? How do we enforce that? So these are real challenges that we're facing now. They're not artificial. The other piece is then, if we're looking for attitude rather than aptitude, where do we go? And there's this big push now to STEM, like science, technology, engineering, maths. We're seeing a shift now to STEAM, and the A is arts and humanities. The ability to philosophize, the ability to look more broadly, the ability to form arguments. There's a fabulous lady called Genevieve Bell who was very, very senior in Intel and really driving a large piece of their thinking in the future world. And she's an anthropologist. That's the kind of skill set that we need, that we need coming forward. And the other piece as well then is, what does this do to corporate culture? So suddenly you're going to get humans utilizing machine learning, working alongside machines, and thinking even further forward, a contract versus permanent workforce. They may not even be in the same room. How do you create a common culture, a common platform? How do you go forward? Some of the concepts could be unintended. If you replace actuaries with robots, when they find that people actually like robots, and they like to have lunch, take breaks. I tell people about that. That's a terrible joke. We have lovely actuaries. But this is the kind of stuff that we're looking at. And suddenly there's a shift from moving towards creating a common platform and processes to actually creating a common purpose. So anyway, I could talk about this for hours, you could say. As Ashley said, the conversation will evolve and go forward. But all I want to get across to you is that I don't think we're expert in finding the answers, but absolutely it's on our minds. And it's on our minds as a today problem, not something that's we look at the future.
Thank you, Patrick.
Can you hear me at the back? Do we need interpretive dance?
Yes, we do.
7-4. Michael? No. Patrick Kirby is my name. I'm with KPMG. I sit in our management consulting space. I started my career in the second industrial revolution, experienced the third, and now sort of preparing clients and others for the fourth industrial revolution. I'm assuming most people sort of know what those terms are, but basically I start off my introduction by saying that to reinforce that change is continuous and disruption is continuous. Early parts of my career I was with IBM, and at that time some of the first things I was working on was field force transformation, moving away from having technicians always having to go out to you always having to go to the branch. I sort of quipped, in most of the rest of the world, you don't actually go into a bank anymore. In fact, friends, family of mine in Australia can quite happily go for years without going into a bank branch anymore. It seems to be impossible to do that here for all sorts of reasons, and another conversation in another room. I then lived through and helped facilitate sort of that next major transformation, which was the move to BPO. So whether that meant staff augmentation using language skills by taking service requests and activities from Japan and moving them to Australia, then moving through labour arbitrage to the Philippines, India, Korea, northern China, and different places. So in many ways we've seen a lot of this sort of disruption before. And along the way I've been involved with designing internet strategy for the PC business, what was coined back in, I think it was 1997 or 98, the term autonomic computing, which was an aspiration for self-healing computers, which were all really just different ways of changing the value chain. And through that experience, HRs had to be able to go through and respond in different ways. The model and the relationship with staff have evolved and changed through that. And I think what we're seeing with artificial intelligence coming through, is that that will need to change again. And I think that'll be sort of one of the key themes that we explore today. I think the other thing, we'll get, as we have this conversation, we'll sort of swing between violent bouts of optimism to manic rounds of depression. I'm going to start this off by saying I'm generally an optimist, but I tend to trust but validate with a lot of these parts. And the last thing I'd say just in my opening is that artificial intelligence is real, it's hard. We've gone through a period where 18 months ago it was like watching the movie 2001 again. Computers were going to become live, take over the world. Terminators were going to destroy humanity in lots of different places. One of the things I've seen over the last sort of 6 to 12 months is a bit of a quietening down on that. The headline topic in articles that we publish at KPMG, The Economist, everyone who's a thought leader in this space, they've sort of tempered some of their message. And my counsel to everybody here is I think we're actually in a bit of the eye of the storm. I suspect we're going through that period where people are trying to figure out how it works. They've gone through what Gartner talks the peak of expectation, and now we're going to hit that trough of disillusionment before we go through a bit of a plateau. So if you're hearing within your business that the robotic process automation or AI or so forth hasn't worked and we don't need to worry about it, my counsel would be get ready, there's another wave coming.
I'm just going to ask each of you two questions. The first is, what opportunities do you see for HR, either from a practical perspective in terms of the places where AI can be helpful? So in Kate's session this morning, for example, she showed us the Unilever example of onboarding. So any other examples you see where AI can have a real tangible application and benefit to the HR function? And then once you will give me your thoughts on that, it would be quite helpful to then go back and say, what do you think the challenges are for HR? So I'll start with you.
Yep. And I think we'll all have plenty, so I'll just mention one and then run down the line. One of the really exciting applications of AI is actually performance management. So the paragon of this in the 70s and 80s, I think, was GE. That forced distribution, draconian performance management structure, and they've actually abandoned it all and they've done something different. What we're playing with now is exactly this, not just this annual process where you wait till the end of the year, or even climate surveys, you wait till one point in time where you get everything. By the time you get the data, it's already out of date, and you're responding to something that's not live. We're going with live feedback. So people at the end of each project give you a review. They give a quick rating, they give comments, they give feedback. So you're monitoring as you go through. And the pilot country we're trying it in, some of the results are actually quite interesting. You can see the sort of welfare, if you like, or the engagement wax and wane as workload cuts in, as business competitive pressures cut in, even as leaders and managers change. So that's one of the really big pieces that I think AI can help us.
So, I mean, I guess maybe rather than talking about specific business, processes, coming from my background, I don't work in HR myself, so might not be the best person to comment on that. But I guess one way that it will have to change, at least, is I think the HR function will need to become much more active in outreaching to education systems to make sure that sort of at the national level or at the local level, that schools are really preparing the next generation workforce to engage in these in these offices where things are changing so quickly that a lot of these sort of box ticking jobs and the jobs that are granted for aptitude rather than attitude will not be around anymore. So the HR function will need to evolve alongside sort of superstructure underneath. And in the Economist Intelligence Unit, we just released a report sort of that looks at 35 different countries around the world and the extent to which their education systems are preparing sort of the next generation for the sort of coming challenges. So STEM education is part of that, so that's always going to be important to have this sort of fundamental grounding in math and science, reading and everything. But then, the A that you mentioned, the arts, we kind of, unpack that into various different skill sets. So we have interdisciplinary skills, leadership skills, entrepreneurial skills, civic and social awareness skills. And these are things that I think, HR people, as they get, as AI impacts their workforce, and they are getting these applications which aren't fitting anymore because there's not jobs for these kinds of applicants to do anymore. They're going to need to realize that they just can't exist in their corporate silo anymore. They need to engage with the world and with society and with education systems, with education ministries, to really sort of change the overall paradigm and make sure that schools are producing the kind of workers that they need.
I think you're right. I think there's also going to be a change at the recruitment, the entry point, in terms of what is it that we're looking for, what do our application forms and processes say that we're looking for, and how are we testing people, and is that actually getting the right people that we need, because those forms and processes that work now or 5 years ago are not necessarily going to be bringing to the top of the pile the people that we're going to need in the next 5 to 10 years.
HR people need to be doing more things like this, engaging with each other, engaging with other parts of society.
My 5-year-old's about to start coding classes next year, which I find insane. But I mean, the depressing thing is that by the time he comes through, what he's learned will be completely useless.
Yeah.
But at least he will have the skills to hopefully then adapt to whatever.
Understand.
Exactly.
Patrick?
An interesting way of thinking about AI is that it's helping automate and augment what in, say, the industrial processing period would be done by physical robotics. So I think part of the low-hanging fruit is how do some of the mechanical, daily, repetitive tasks of the HR function leverage AI in particular ways. And I think there's an obvious one about employee interaction, service inquiries, much as you're seeing between business and customer. We're training ourselves for that type of responsiveness. I make the point often that Facebook doesn't have a help desk to call. It's using those types of systems to fulfill those types of queries. If you look in China, what happens on WeChat and so forth, many of these other platforms, as a way of fulfilling in real time or near real time inquiries is an obvious part where AI will play in HR. I think the other one, which taps onto talent and it taps onto culture, particularly in the Hong Kong aspect, pardon me, is then how can AI help facilitate the creative and the innovative side of business, help to drive that type of discussion. It's not just the HR function that's being disrupted at the moment within business. Almost all industries are being disrupted at the moment. And so I think HR has a really important role as helping, being the ambassador and the guardian for that human capital to help go through and drive that change that's required. I spend a lot of time with banks, with telcos, with governments, and across all of those industries, they're having the discussion what's happening to our space. The whole industries are being redefined in different ways. So if you're going to tap into that human capital to make the business resilient and transformative, then AI has a way of driving that communication and enabling that.
Ashley?
Yeah, following on from both Michael and Patrick's comments, I think one of the areas in which HR is going to be changed, or needs to change, and organisationally we need these changes, is that the pace of change now is enormous. I mean, if you try and predict what your workforce is going to need to look like in 5 years, 10 years, it's an extremely difficult thing to do now. 20 years ago, it was relatively easy to do that. Okay, so what HR is going to need to do is it's going to need to focus on the people that it's already got and how it helps them to adapt to the changes. Right? I think there's going to be well, there already is to an extent, but there's going to need to be a process of continual learning, and HR has got to facilitate that continual learning inside its organisation. Now, there's some discussion as to whether that actually is something that the state should do, in the form of schools and education in a more formal sense. My take on that is that they're actually too slow. I don't care where it is. It can be, as progressive as Finland. It can be as backward as wherever. And but it's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen at the pace that it needs to happen. And so, as I said earlier, HR is going to have to be part of that in terms of training its existing workforce for where they see it being required in 5 years, but there's also going to be a much bigger emphasis on the individual to make sure that they keep their skills up to date. As has been alluded to before, we're seeing a change in the shape of corporations now as well. There's going to be like a core of full-time employees, and there's going to be more and more contingent workers coming in and out. Okay, so there's the cultural issue that has been mentioned, but it's also how do you manage that? And if you're one of those contingent workers, how do you manage to keep your skills up to date to make sure that you can go on to your next gig? And so I see a role in the private educational sector for skill training. I'll give you an example. There's a HR Analytics Academy in the Netherlands now. It's a privately owned company. Turns out very, very good courses for those people who are already in HR, maybe see analytics as being something that they need to get onto. Maybe they can't get that training inside their current company because it's not available, because the HR hierarchy hasn't really got into that yet. So they're going to have to go and pay for that themselves. So I think there's going to be a combination of both self-learning and instruction learning from the existing corporations. But I really would not rely on state educational bodies to satisfy this, because, like I said, they're just too slow.
Guys, I do want to just touching on the culture point and the change in the workforce, which I think is really important one, which is, how have you been addressing, what challenges have you had in terms of, there's so many different facets to it. Part of it is making the people that you've got not feel terrified about the world about to come to an end and their jobs about to be made redundant. Part of it's about promoting adaptability, and part of it's dealing with the gig workforce with your permanent workforce. And what kind of things have you been doing or have you been seeing?
Yeah. So I'll address this as succinctly as I can from three perspectives. The first one is this combined workforce. And what's now happening is you are going to get contractors, you're going to get remote workers, and dare I say it, you're going to get people who actually program machine learning, all working together. So very quickly acclimatizing people to what is your culture needs to be the key, working closely with each other. So there's a big movement at the moment. It's being led by a guy called Simon Sinek. You've seen him on YouTube. Well, let's start with the why. So that why then becomes the beacon as to why people come to work with you, and why they may come to work with you and not AIA or some other insurance company where we're going to very quickly grab people together. But it is a challenge to very quickly get people, not just multi-generational, but gig economy people, consultants, whatever, work on the same basis. So it's that cultural point, and that's where it's another opportunity for HR to actually play a role with leaders to bring forth value of culture. The second then is creating, and this is very difficult, so easy to say, so hard to do, creating a culture where you take away the fear that people will not have careers. And you've also got to be realistic, because some people won't have careers. But you've got to prepare them for that shift and get them ready to move on. You're going to ask what some of the greatest challenges for HR are. This is the challenge, is the opportunity. We are terrible at this. It's just not our skill set. It's not our skill set to look beyond. How can we get this person prepared for the future? Because the shifts will be quite terrifying for people within one industry, but it could open up elsewhere. And the example I use is the PC revolution. Everyone was fearful that it would take away a whole heap of jobs, and it did. Data processing, people in the typing pool, whatever. It created a raft of jobs. Over 90% of them are a different industry. How do we prepare people for that? And then the final piece, let me just finish on this one. The final piece is you also have an overlay of national culture. So what I find just quite intriguing, having a regional role, is that in some countries there is a fear of AI, and it's sort of second cousin robotics. And it's very much also a Western paradigm. You go way back to our literature and everything from Frankenstein's monster to Blade Runner. But I covered Japan as well, and there's a much different view on robotics, right? Robots are your friend. I'm giving away my age, but I used to love watching Gigantor, right? As a kid, all the Japanese stuff. They are much more up for this. And then aging population is much more welcoming of this. So it's not always running with age. So I'm sorry, a bit of a rambling answer, but the cultural changes that we require, they're immense.
And sort of just like building off from that, one thing that I've heard in terms of the way that you can sort of conceptualize the three kind of big sort of broad categories of roles that will sort of be necessary in this kind of very AI-powered workplace. You can think of one of them as kind of like the orchestrator, right? Like defining the problem that needs to be solved, looking at it from, you know, from the mountain peak, and really just sort of directing all the different processes, people, machines, whatever it is below that. The second is sort of the designer, making sure that the sort of the end-to-end solution, you know, comes together, that it's still human-centric, right? Even if AI is able to help them solve whatever problem it is, that this is still something that, you know, people can understand and makes sense to them, right? And then the third is the policeman, making sure that AI is doing what it's supposed to be doing, that the biases, that it's as free from bias as possible, which is maybe something we can get into a little bit later, and that the data also is you know, robust and good quality. There's sort of a fourth, I guess, category, which is sort of something that, you know, infuses into all the top three, which is just the creative kind of jobs. You know, someone just to have that spark, right? I mean, AI, for as good as it can be to help you solve, you know, problems, increase your efficiency, it might not, you know, probably just won't get that spark, right? That's what I'm saying in terms of AI being able to do everything that humans can do. There's just that sort of sense of that gut feeling that AI doesn't necessarily
So
get.
in the studies that you've done, or the case studies you've seen and research that you've come across, have you come across any epic fails of AI where it's not done what it was supposed to do?
Well, I don't know if we would call this an epic fail, but this is something that you can sort of point to as, you know, you can definitely point to it as something where AI, where there is improvements that need to be made. So one example that I've seen was in a customer service function. Customer service is now like probably the number one, you know, most made redundant job, right? But say the parameter that you give your AI algorithm is the KPI is basically if you're engaging, as a customer service representative, you're engaging in an email exchange with a customer, and the goal is to basically keep that exchange as short as possible. You know, that's a mark of a good customer service representative. If you basically allow AI to sort of operate along those parameters, they may very well just piss off the customer so much that they just stop replying, and then the email chain is only, you know, three back and forth long. And there you hit your KPI, and it's brilliant, right? Like the chain's done, and that's it. So what you need to do is understand that when you're giving AI a set of instructions, it's only as good as the algorithm you give it. I guess sort of on the flip side of that is, you know, some of the evangelists would say, an advanced AI systems can actually evolve the algorithm along, you know, as it's going, right? It's not just these parameters are not static, right? So maybe the email example is sort of from, like, you know, AI 1.0 or something, or 2.0, or now we're in AI you know, Z.0 or whatever. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
I want to start with a thank you to the panel, because I just realised we're 90 minutes in across these two, and no one has blamed millennials yet.
The intergeneration.
We actually haven't blamed millennials, and the reason I say that is because for all of the talk that so often goes on about them wanting to change jobs and experience the world, which I think actually every generation has always wanted to do, the nature of work has also changed. I mean, employers don't want long-time, 25-year service people in their business anymore because of the change, because of everything else that's going on within their business. The reason I bring that up from an AI perspective then is how are you going to go through and map out those skills. The second point that I make, millennial or otherwise, people don't generally like change, right? And people up here love to espouse the excitement of work and the dynamism and the excitement of challenge, and most people in the real world actually are quite happy to go and get their paycheck, then go and spend their night with their kids, or go and play footy on the weekend, or go fishing, or, you know, having other exercises. So there are a lot of other aspects then to the workforce, which are then being influenced by both AI, the workforce automation, so the robotic automation, which is augmenting and changing the process at the one side, and then fundamentally new business models that are coming out the back. And I think one of the challenges for HR people is they need to figure out with their workforce, how do they keep them motivated and engaged when there's sort of this triple threat that's coming through. Are they going to have to fundamentally change and work? As is their job going to be redefined because it's being augmented at one side, or do they really just disappear because of physical assets or chatbot assets at the other side?
You can kind of think of this, I guess, we were having this discussion just, right before this panel, and on the one hand, yes, people whose literally their only core competence is to, crunch numbers or something, they're probably, they probably need to, like, step up to the plate or get shipped out. But on the other hand, you can think of this as such an opportunity in the sense of really freeing people to kind of, explore sort of more creative intellectual sort of challenges. For example, stepping up to the orchestrator role, being the designer type. I mean, these are jobs that really require you to use your higher brain functions.
Yeah,
right?
but the problem with, that's the bit like Marx saying, when we have communism, you'll be able to go work in the morning and then have leisure all afternoon. I can't remember it.
Yeah.
Because I was a Marxist a long time ago. I can't remember. I think that this is one of the issues, is that a lot of people are not going to be able to do that. There are, the vast majority of people, frankly, they're not creative. Okay, so it's all very well to talk about it in the abstract, but in reality, this is not going to happen.
I mean,
sorry. And another point Gautam mentioned, he used the word career. So what the hell does that mean?
What does that mean?
Yeah.
It used to be you go in here at entry level, and if you worked hard and then after 30 years you'd be up here. Okay, that isn't the case anymore. In fact, there's no career path because nothing that you can predict in 5 or 10 years is probably going to come true. Right? So you've just got to be continually adaptable. And so when we talk about things like career path, forget it. Now, I don't have an answer to that as to what you substitute for it, but it's a dead issue.
Well, at the utmost extreme, it seems like the more optimistic view is that once we're all made redundant, we can just go and have picnics all day and get universal basic income.
What's so
bad about that?
I'm perfectly okay with that.
Exactly.
I think we've run that social experiment, right, and it didn't sort of play out quite as planned. To your point.
Was it Finland that was doing the universal basic?
No, I mean just generally.
General Marxism.
General Marxism.
Oh no, Marxism, yes, but I'm just no work at all.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Not even a means of production because it's all automated. It's all done by machines.
Yeah.
Hi, yeah, we-
Can I just interrupt with a question or a comment? My name's Emma Dale and I run a recruitment business specialising in communications. And your comment just now about career path and your comment is so interesting because in my experience, the most junior people that I deal with want a career path.
Yeah.
And they say to me, I'm leaving this company because there's no career path for me. I want stability. So in actual fact, these are the people that actually do want a career path, but we're not going to have them for them.
Yeah.
And I think they're struggling to know what the hell do they do, because I've been told I need stability and my parents want me to have a stable job. And
Sorry.
Let me just address that. I'm not sure I'm using the right words here, but what we have at the moment, a very interesting mismatch between capability and capacity. Right? So I would hate to put every single baby boomer in this category, but we have benefited from ridiculous times of peace. We haven't had to go off and kill each other. Enormous asset growth. All the wealth lies with us. So we have the capacity to make this shift, but perhaps, with the exception of my esteemed colleagues who know a lot more about AI than I do, maybe not the capability. We haven't got those skill sets and so on. This should be the province of people coming up now viewed as exciting. They can shift, they can do one thing or the other, but society's not set up that way. We sit here and look at people and say, where's your steady career path? I'm sorry. A bank will say, what the hell, I'm not giving you a loan. So part of this need for this career and what have you, I don't know if it's what, you may be in a better position to tell me this, I don't know if it's necessarily what people want, but it's what you kind of need, and it's a horrific world, where there aren't graduate roles and so on, right? If we could move beyond that to free people up, then maybe we won't have this career path, which is why I agree with you, actually. I think your career paths are now big.
Can I ask the service supervisor to the Hong Kong market in particular?
not necessarily, but to be honest with you, it is the Hong Kong Chinese.
So then, I think that explains
that's-
a lot of it. Yeah, we discussed. Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is part of the culture, right? And when you have education systems and cultures which emphasize get a steady job that pays a steady paycheck, and the fact of the matter is that they're usually in these kinds of fields, right?
But they're going to be set up to fail, aren't they? This is what they think they should have, go and get a steady job, etc. It's not going to happen.
Well, then it needs to, the change needs to be bigger than just, what the kids are thinking.
Yeah,
Can I add
mean,
another, I was going to say, can I add another piece to that field there? What is the role of, well, whether it's business, government, or whose role is it, number one? Business, government, industry bodies, or specialist bodies, or in addressing this from a social point of view? And I come back to that parent thing, is the perception very often is society and parents and so on say, you need to be, in Hong Kong it's the big five, doctor, a lawyer, a banker, an engineer, and so on, and 40% of those roles are going to disappear within the next 10 to 15 years. So what is it that we as industry, or we as specialist bodies or whatever, are doing to engage society, or how should we do that in a way that helps make that transition you're talking about?
Well,
We have the capacity, but not the capability.
I'm a member of the Hong Kong Mums Facebook page, so it's absolutely not the parents.
Not at all.
Absolutely. So it's got to be a mix. I think the conspicuous one you missed off that list is also the individual, right? What role do they play? Because it is a bigger piece. You can't stand on the beach holding the Bible and argue about the tsunami. The wave is coming, right? And so everyone needs to figure out how they move up. So if that water's washing at their feet, they're reasonably safe. We spoke about this before as well. One of the interesting phenomena for me is why is everyone now wringing their hands around around artificial intelligence, right? I mean, we've spoken even on this panel so far about the displacement of jobs for hundreds of years, since the spinning jenny, right? People and typing tools have gone. But the really interesting thing for me now is it's not somebody else that's being affected. The part of the value chain which is now really under threat are auditors, lawyers, doctors, right? So you're now at the top, theoretically, of that sort of career pyramid. So where do you go to? I presented some World Economic Forum results to our partnership. And we're an audit and tax business. And the prediction there was something like 60 to 80% of all audit, or 60 to 80% of all audit is going to be done by AI in the next 5 years. Well, let me tell you, I had to sort of keep my back to the wall for the next couple of weeks so that they were coming after me. It's a real challenge. That's what people don't like to sort of wrestle with.
I mean, I think when you were asking about sort of how to engage, right? Like how do people like yourselves, change the paradigm and whatnot. So, I mean, going back to sort of the education aspect and that angle, much of the discussion around education is about accessibility, right? But are you increasing accessibility for the kind of education that's going to be completely irrelevant, right? So actually, I mean, I was just discussing with an executive at the I think it was the Peninsula Hotel Group, or one of the large Hong Kong hotel groups, and she was discussing how after she saw basically our report on educating for the future and all the different skill, the different sort of soft skill set buckets that are going to be needed, they reframed their philanthropy goals, because they do a lot of education philanthropy, and I can tell you, I've done a lot of research on this. Education philanthropy in Asia is very huge. Among all the high net worth individuals, the corporates, they're all donating to this regard. But she said that they reframed their corporate philanthropy to make sure that their NGO partners are providing and emphasizing these skills in the education space, rather than just let's just get a book in front of a kid and make sure that they know how to read and do maths, right? So this, I think, I mean, yes, it's indirect, but this is some place where people with decision-making power can really make a difference.
And I think, and again, I know this is going a long way from tangible HR stuff, but I think part of this also, I think, actually, not waiting and relying on education. It's a much broader experience. So in the future, it may well be that it's Chinese companies that come to dominate the world, but right now it's Western companies. And if you look at Asian executives in Western companies, there's only one country that tends to produce global executives to a large extent these days, and that's India. And that has a very fixed rote learning education system. So why is this happening? It's because the rest of life in India is ridiculously chaotic. Getting to school every morning is one hell of an experience. You could get transferred 40 kilometers up the road and they're speaking a different language, eating a different food, and as a young executive said to me, I had to work out who to bribe all over again. So, it's that kind of resilience that we need to build outside the education system to get our people here. And the two countries I work very closely with, I work with about 15, the two countries I work very closely with where unfortunately I don't see this are Hong Kong and Singapore. So I'd say part of the preparation is beyond education. And I know that goes a long way from what we're discussing today, but I think that's what we need to do.
But just to bring it back to HR, I think what would be quite interesting to hear your views on is, where do you see HR in this process? Do you see them as kind of having to persuade stakeholders and management that this is happening, we need to be ready, we need to be changing what we're doing now? Or are you seeing that they're being kind of more reactive and not being permitted to do what they think they need to do? Where are you seeing HR fitting in?
So there's where let's be honest about this, there's where we should be and there's where we are.
Let's talk about where we should be.
There's a huge difference between the two. Well, the only thing with that one though, Helen, is the gap means will we ever get there?
Yeah.
And the answer is at the moment questionable.
I mean, I think there's two aspects.
Actually, why don't you take this up? You have good views on this.
There's the corporate, if you like, the strategic aspect. You know, what the CEO decides and the board, and they often can see it, but in my experience, the HR people don't really get it, and I've seen so many instances where a strategic direction is set by the corporation, and it's just not followed through by the HR people for whatever reason. You know? And so, I think where we should be is that we HR people should be driving this conversation. I think that we should have the skills and the data, the information that we need to drive this conversation, but HR has not typically been in that role. It's not been in a strategic role, and that can be a fault on both sides. So to follow, I mean, where we are and where we should be, there's a huge gap, and where we should be bit is going to be very, very difficult to get through. But I think it's essential that we do it. There are some companies that have done this. I've mentioned Google before. As an example, Accenture, there are successful companies that have achieved this, but the real lesson doesn't seem to have permeated through the industry as a whole, I regret to say.
I think you're absolutely right. And then if you look at why we should get there, why it's important, and I know it's a simplistic view, but what is it that's ultimately going to be what sets companies apart? It's not so much access to capital. Maybe central bank tightening the world is awash with money at the moment. And interestingly enough, artificial intelligence means that people will learn from what's already out there and adapt and go forward. So the extent to which these things become a sustainable competitive advantage is going to also get wiped away quite quickly. It is in fact in that talent, and the ability to apply judgment, and the ability to have that small core who can move forward. Now, arguably, that's not the job of HR, that's the job of the leadership team. This is where HR can play this role, in keeping that to the top of people's agenda and thinking about the kind of workforce we need and go forward. That's what's needed. But yes, maybe I'm being overly pessimistic, but it's very rare to see people with those skill sets. We struggle to even interpret data, today's data.
Would you fathom that HR would be a vertical that is completely made redundant?
The requirements of HR in terms of people leadership, whatever will be there, in terms of the function of good welfare.
In terms of your question around HR's role in readiness for AI, one of the things we saw in the outsourcing and BPO phenomenon is this vacuum in skill and experience, and some of that human glue that continues to sort of get unbound as service functions move overseas or move out to third parties or so forth. And one of the things I see is, companies are now struggling 5 years after they've done that to figure out, who is that person that actually knows how all those systems sort of work together. We think there was someone and they moved to another department, we better go and tap them on the shoulder and see if they can correctly remember what's going on. I think we'll have an amplification of that issue when AI comes through, whether it's around diagnosing issues or processing these types of queries. Actually understanding it will be a gap. And so part of the role for HR is to, how do you go through I think in most instances with a totally reprofiled workforce, how do you get that right type of talent to fit in some of those different spaces with the continuity? I think that's going to be a real challenge. I don't have an answer to that one yet.
I think it's really important, and also changing the mindset. So I'm going to choose this as an illustration. The very sensible question you put is, have you seen instances where AI has led to completely distorted, ridiculous examples? The answer is yes, but nowhere near as many that were the subject of human folly, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Betamax video recorders, New Coke, all of that, right? Machine didn't come up with that. Right? So it's getting our own executives comfortable and a very experienced set. And predominantly, dare I say it, white middle-aged men in their 60s, to basically say, we don't know all the answers and we're not protected, we shouldn't fear this one. That's the difficulties that we need to, so I think you're exactly right, actually, helping people transition and make a change. And perhaps being brave enough to be the last one to turn the lights out as you dispose of your own job is what we need.
I think the other risk, in the professional services space, is what does that mean ultimately for quality? So, in the audit space, I'm not an auditor, but a lot of that is cutting your teeth, working in ridiculous hours for good market rates, whatever that means, to sort of learn the craft and figure out what that means so that you can then apply critical thinking as you progress. Similarly, in the legal profession, I'm sure that there are hundreds of thousands of hours that are expended within that business, sort of learning law, going through the process, observing others, failing, watching what happens to win. And so if I have a look at the displacement projections that 60-80% of audit is going to be done by AI in the next couple of years, what does that mean about that learning? If we have a look at the example in the legal profession, systems like Ross are going through and consolidating all legal case law around the world and putting it into a consolidated update for you overnight. It's able to do some of the analysis, not through Ross, but through other platforms around, which judges should you be going to, right? What should those sort of compositions be about where you go through and have case law prosecuted and so forth. That takes time, that takes experience. That is the human weakness, actually, that is overcome by AI.
Absolutely. I think I was reading something where it drew the analogy between a child and human learning and machine learning. Every one of us, we all have to learn to walk. We all have to learn to talk. A machine, and we could only do that in a very, very sort of step process. A machine or an AI entity, whatever you want to call it, once it's learned, it doesn't unlearn it. And they can then go on and build the next generation of machines without having to learn to walk again. So the pace of learning in a machine environment or AI environment is much, much faster than what human beings can actually keep up with because they can't replicate it.
At the same time, there's also sort of like a form of argument that sort of offers a bit more hesitation and a bit more constraint against it in the sense that, as AI is sort of helping you solve these problems and as it's sort of, spitting out its solutions, basically, its outcomes, the big issue is that it can't explain why it came to the conclusion that it did, right? The thing that sets it apart from...
Very often human beings can't do that.
Yeah, exactly.
What I was going to say, that the big thing that sets it apart is AI can consider so many more factors than its human equivalents, right? It can consider such a long chain of variables and parse them out so much more quickly, right? But if we were to try to get it to explain itself, it wouldn't be able to, and we wouldn't necessarily understand it because it's just so long and complicated and sort of abstruse and what is variable X, Y, and Z doing there. But at the same time, there are sort of ways through that. And one example I brought up in the last session is, if you're a human expert interacting with an AI entity, a software algorithm or whatever, you can sort of grade it, right? You can look at the different outcomes, different possibilities that it's giving you, and say, I like this one. I'm going to give it an A or whatever, and then you can explain why, and then it can learn, right? So it's not just about it's not, I mean, at this stage at least, it's not just about AI evolving on its own. It really does require this kind of dynamic two-way street, this process between people and AI.
And that's right, it's not an either or, it's a both, because the premise is that AI is learning from a world where it can intelligently interpret, and the world itself is corrupted and flawed. Right? So, for example, simple example, most users of social media platforms, what have you, are women, and yet 80% of people who design are males. And you wonder what the world would look like if that had been reversed. Would we be having these safety issues and harassment and what have you, who knows? So the human touch is actually deciphering that and say, do we perpetuate this or do we not? Do we look for different things? Do we look for different angles? So I think that's where the linkages come in. But having said that, you cannot underestimate the ability of AI to cut through a lot of prejudices and just put before you cold, hard facts. Right? I think that's the blending that you actually need to be able to make.
I mean, I guess you need to see how fast AI, your prediction on how fast it itself can evolve.
There's a guy who's strapping himself to a rocket over the next couple of days to prove that the world is flat. If that's not one of the best examples for the year that man is not rational, I don't know what it is.
So we have a couple of questions.
Yeah, but artificial intelligence is a case of probability and tolerance. So anyone who's done even sort of introductory philosophy has probably been exposed to the train and the tunnel test. You know, if you've got a train with 10 people and there's a child on the train tracks, do you derail the train or do you run over the child? Right? And at what point do you decide that it's better to drive through rather than to cause that other damage? That's the type of modelling that has to go on. And I think we'll start to be exposed with some of these sort of legal liability issues about how much confidence have you got with artificial intelligence? How much can you trust it? How much can you depend upon it? And in that medical example that Gautam was talking about before, I wish the person that goes up to court being sued because they've decided not to follow the AI information, I wish them the very best with their getting reinsurance or malpractice insurance, because I think it's going to get to a point which, well, the AI has gone through and determined that will be a more trusted source. That's absolutely where we're getting to.
So I know the questions, but one very quick illustration is my son goes to a school in Australia that's obsessed with rowing, and the team that won, I think they won the Henley Regatta this year, they were identified at 12 years old, based on a whole bunch of statistics, data, etc., etc. Contrast that with us listening to an interview with Maradona, short, fat little guy who didn't kick with his right foot. He never would have been selected if you use that kind of information. So that's the kind of, the delicious kind of world we live in now, where there's an interface between the two. The questions, but
yes, just a question.
Hi, my name is Daniela Adaji. I work for Aegeus, a multinational insurance company. A lot of questions a little bit earlier about the unknown with AI coming into play. A lot of emotions around it, some of excitement, some of fear, people not knowing about their future careers and so forth. But let's spin it around a little bit. Given everything that you've said, what does best practice look like for employees with regards to AI in the organization?
Do you want to take the question?
I'm not even sure there is such a thing as best practice, with a few standout exceptions. So what Google are doing in terms of analytics, purely analytics, right? I would argue nothing much more at this stage. Well, it's fantastic analytics. Some of their work on what makes high-performing teams, some of their work on taking out their own people's unconscious bias in their hiring, what have you, is groundbreaking, right? Phenomenal stuff. But really, and I think Ashley would be a better place to talk about this as well, as barely scratch the surface. Barely scratch the surface in terms of in-depth analytics, in terms of instant feedback, in terms of a whole range of areas. So I'd say the exciting piece right now is that you really shouldn't be benchmarking against anything, because what may be good is something totally different. What you should be looking at is your own individual organization's needs.
And I think if you were to go, I mean, if you're asking the question, what's best practice for an organization? I mean, what the organization, what industry is it in? what function does the person have, right? Because AI will literally can potentially permeate everything. And I mean, what kind of AI are you talking about, right? Are you talking, what level of machine learning algorithm are you employing? What is your KPI for it? So I mean, I mean, I completely 100% agree. The idea of best practices just needs to be completely rethought.
So, I don't know if there's a best practice, but I think there are some things to be thinking about. The first part of this, I'll frame through the quality lens. So, what role can AI play in making sure that there are towards zero defects as you're going through the value chain? Whatever that process is. If that's a fulfillment exercise, if that's an accounting process, how can it provide a role to pick up? We're starting to see predictive analytics about where is failure likely to occur, and therefore how can you respond? So using IoT and AI is a good example about how our business is getting smarter at knowing when our telecom towers, submarine cables, other devices likely to fail, and therefore focus your workforce to make sure that you're able to do that in time, and not be expending effort doing routine checks because it says on the side of the box that you need to do it every year.
Can I just jump in right there? I mean, on the failure aspect, if you look at autopilot, right? I mean, that's technically kind of an AI system, right? The best practice there is if the plane doesn't crash. So, I mean, anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. Following on from that, I mean, AI has been demonstrated that it can fly a plane. I mean, it's much easier to do that than to be driving cars for all sorts of instances. So this gets to my second point. I talked about quality. The second one is the customer experience. So best practice is making sure that you're able to delight customers and make sure that they're getting incremental value by your interaction. So as you move away from pricing differentiation or commoditized differentiation towards advocacy type of issues, then there's a role that AI can play in, again, determining where are things likely to fail, where are there suspicious transactions. Those types of activities can really add value to the process. So I always sort of try to think through things about either cost and growth or quality and customer. There's sort of four easy ways of thinking about how do you prioritise the use of artificial intelligence experimentation and implementation within the business. The last thing about best practice is know the data. Understand the quality of your data. Data is always poor. And the only reason that statement is untrue because it's much worse than poor, but I'm being videotaped. Right? It is always horrendous, and companies are starting to appreciate over the last 18 months, 2 years, actually the huge gap in what data they're able to extract, which is easy for AdWords, right, and some behavioural analytics, but not so strong with other large parts of the business.
Yeah, I mean,
so that's why people will still need to be there.
Why is Google so good at this? It's because it has 2 billion people using its search engine every day. It's got more data than has ever been generated in the history of humanity, basically. And why also do people think that China is going to be the AI leader? Is because it's got 1.4 billion people that are all using one app called WeChat. So, which is then piped directly into the Chinese government.
We've got about 2 minutes there, so I just want to check if there's any more questions.
I'm afraid I might not. I'm afraid I might not ask a 2-minute question, but my name's Monica Nolan-Misley. I'm from Tory Burch, and I have a regional role. And I've started to think, to many of you have been raising that in HR, we have to start transforming into a place where all of our business partners are focusing on strategy rather than what was traditionally considered back office sort of HR ops. And there's been a lot of conversations around shared services, and I'm saying, why don't we just go to AI? Why go through setting up a shared service center when we could just, so much of this back office ops could be put into some sort of AI entity. And it's interesting, the response I'm getting is, but your human resources, there's human in the title, and I'm saying, well, yeah, because you want the human focused on the strategy. Have any of you worked with HR functions that are actually trying to set up AI entities What have your experiences been?
I've not worked with an HR function that's trying to do that. I have worked with some companies that provide technology which would enable that to happen. But you know, unfortunately, I haven't seen it adopted. I don't know.
I think people expect 24/7 responsive service. They have been trained by mobility and everything else to be able to interact that way. That's their preferred channel. We see that app usage for remediation of questions and so forth is the preferred way, not picking up the phone, certainly not going into the branch. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think you're asking absolutely the right question.
Yeah.
Figure out how you clean out some of the noise to provide that service, and then add the value on top.
What do they mean when they say you've got a human in your title? What's the implication?
And I'm at the very beginning of this conversation, but I'm finding it's a very emotional response. It's, well, HR should be a person, right? Even if it's in a shared service center,
Right.
and I'm just emailing them, and I don't even realize I'm actually emailing a portal, but there's a person I could call if everything went wrong, right?
Yeah,
right.
And I'm trying to say, oh, come on, a payroll question. How many people in HR ask you, how much vacation do I have, right? I mean,
Right,
it's-
very interesting. So we can't look forward, but we can certainly look back, and that is not at all promising because HR has never adapted to these models. You know, the old, what's the guy's name? I've forgotten. Where you put the subject matter experts, the centre of excellence, what have you. HR has been the biggest fly in the ointment in making that work because HR hasn't stopped doing the only thing it feels comfortable doing, which is holding line managers' hands.
Right.
So the same kind of thing will happen again. You see these magnificent business cases that consultants, not you of course, magnificent business cases about savings that come to HR about centralised workforce, whatever, and you turn up 2 years later and they haven't dropped a single head.
Yeah.
Because they've continued, they haven't gone down that change path. So my call then, brutal as this may be, is to move to that, don't expect the cooperation of HR.
And I think you'll find a lot of your employees will follow quite quickly.
They will.
You know, that's the, I'm spending some time with a logistics provider at the moment who believe their core value proposition is around aircraft fleet and coverage, all right? And all their customers are telling them, I want to see what's happening in the last mile, and if I've got to WeChat somebody, then I'll do that. So customer behaviour is moving very rapidly, much like the mobility move 10 years ago. I think that's where you get heading.
You don't get turkeys for Christmas.
Thanksgiving.
That's a perfect way to end.
Well,
Thank you very much to our panel. We'll be around for a few minutes and then at lunch if anyone has any follow-up questions. Thank you very much for coming.